The Client is the 7th episode of the 2nd season of The Office, and there are some really brilliant moments in this episode. There's one moment that I didn't really care for, but then things worked out for me by the end. So I will, of course, discuss what I mean by that, and there will be spoilers from now as I go through the episode and share some thoughts. It starts off with something that I had never considered before, but it made me laugh. Pam points out that she thinks Michael started Casual Fridays in the office because he loves the way he looks in jeans, in this particular pair of jeans as well. And I have to say, he looks great, but I'd never thought of that before, and I have worked in offices with Casual Fridays. I never considered the bosses did it because they want to show off how good they look in their ordinary non-work clothes, and now that's all that I can think of, so that was very amusing. We then have 2 parts to the narrative, and they kind of combine together nicely at certain points, and Michael and Jan are meeting a client, and while they're with the client, Michael phones Pam so that she can give him a joke, because Jan told him that he can tell one joke, and then they're getting on with the meeting. And of course, Michael wants to make sure it's a good joke, and Pam gives him some jokes. And then once the phone call is over, she finds a screenplay in among the papers. And I will say, I wish we got to see a little bit more of the screenplay or heard a little bit more of the reading, because everybody then gathers together and they're reading out the screenplay, and Dwight says that they shouldn't be doing this, but Jim tells him he can play Agent Michael Scarn, who is the protagonist, and things are going well until he realises that one of the other characters was written for Dwight. And this comes about because the character was accidentally misspelled Dwigged, which I have to say is just the funniest name ever. Just the way Pam said it. I don't know why, I just found it so funny. And he wasn't happy after that point, and basically Dwight is not happy for the rest of the episode. We get to see some rather beautiful moments between Pam and Jim, and I feel like at this point, if they don't get together, they're setting us up for a huge disappointment. I haven't looked ahead, but I'm going to say I'd be 99% confident that they do get together, and they have this rather romantic evening, and they share some earbuds, which doesn't sound that romantic, but it was really beautifully done. And then we see, and this is the bit that I didn't really want to happen. It felt on the one hand a little bit too obvious, and I was kind of worried that it was going to start something I wouldn't really care for. Michael and Jan end up kissing. Michael goes back to hotel, and they do, as he says, make out a little bit, but nothing more than that. And Dwight wakes up in the office covered in tinfoil. Obviously, he made a blanket, and he looks out the window and sees Jan arriving in a taxi to collect her car. And he's kind of made up his own mind about what happened. He confronted Michael about this, and that's how we find out what happened in the hotel. And Michael definitely came on really strongly. He started to talk about this relationship that they had, which is a lot after just spending a couple of hours together. And he ends up speaking to Jan on the phone, and he says he misses her. And then we find out that actually she wants to see other people. It was a mistake. And Michael is obviously quite crushed by this. But I definitely think he read too much into the situation. So for me, I'm glad that Jan realised it was a mistake. She didn't want to pursue anything. I definitely felt like once she was sober, she would realise that she didn't want to pursue anything. I don't get the impression she likes Michael in general. But at the same time, I felt bad for Michael. And when I started watching The Office, I thought he was the most irritating character ever. I hated him. But over the episodes, I guess as we learn more about him and we see his vulnerabilities and we get to see different sides of him, or also I just feel like he's less irritating now. I actually have become, I don't know if I want to say a fan of Michael as a character. I'm not sure if it's quite there, but certainly I felt bad for him in that moment, which is not what I would have expected back in the first season. And we then have an interesting exchange between Jim and Pam, where Jim says some might say that they had their first date last night as well. And I like the fact that Pam doesn't instantly recoil from that thought. I liked that. And they talked very briefly about it. And then Jim did kind of ruin the moment by mentioning the high school hockey game that Roy had left Pam at not that long ago. The more we learn about him, the more he just seems like a terrible person, which I think is kind of the point, because if eventually Pam does leave him to be with Jim, it's not going to be like, well, she was having emotional feelings for, as opposed to non emotional feelings. She was having feelings for Jim while in a relationship with Roy. Clearly, Roy was just not treating her nicely, so it kind of is understandable that she would step away from Roy and go towards Jim. Whereas if Roy had been treating her really nicely, but she'd been having these moments with Jim, that might have been a little bit harder to swallow. Not that I'm saying she should be having an affair with Jim while still with Roy, but that's not what's happening here. But I feel like it's definitely, hopefully, laying the foundations for Pam to realise that the way Roy is treating her is not the way somebody should be treated when they're in a loving, theoretically loving relationship. So I'm so excited and so hopeful to see what happens there. But yeah, Jim did kind of put his foot in it a little bit when he mentioned the hockey game. And we have this fabulous moment. The last thing in the episode is where Jim and Michael just kind of look at each other and they give each other a kind of look of understanding. Because in terms of their love life, they're both very much in a similar situation. I'd say Jim's is maybe a little bit deeper because there is actually potential for him with Pam, not so much for Michael with Jan, but there was that moment of understanding, a brief connection between Jim and Michael, which I rather enjoyed. I thought this was a really solid episode. The client was really enjoyable. I was concerned it was going to go into a direction with Jan that I wasn't going to enjoy, but for me, all's well that ends well. The client was definitely a really enjoyable episode.